particularly when they are massed together. And it takes a very clever artillerist, of course, to fire over his own troops and into the ranks of the enemy. The enemy is now massing far more men than they had before, that's for certain. They are forming lines inside the front gate. And as you can see, the idea is to fire, get closer, get closer, get closer, engage the enemy until basically it's almost like a game of chicken. Who's going to break first? Who's going to turn around and try and get away from the withering musket fire that's taking place on that field? As you can see, the fife and drummers are moving off the field of battle, away from harm's way, allowing the soldiers to get down to their work.
Now, it should be noted with all these volleys, a lot of people ask why did they fight in the big long lines, and the simple reason is technology. The weapons of the time period are flintlock smoothbore muskets, which means the flintlock mechanism, very unreliable. Even in best conditions, the British Army said 20% rates of misfire. So that's pretty serious. You add to that the fact it lacks rifling to give the ball a spin, making it accurate. These weapons, anything past 100 yards, good luck. Or for any of our metric friends, anything past 93 meters. So these weapons, inaccurate, unreliable. The only effective way to use them on the field was in mass volleys. The hope being that enough weapons will fire, enough lead will go down range, that someone hits something across the battlefield. And that always makes people chuckle a little bit, but the fact of the matter is everybody was doing it. It was just the way it was done.
And now you can see as well, ladies and gentlemen, the amount of musket smoke that's going on that battlefield. It's where, of course, the phrase, the fog of war, comes from. In a very, very humid condition like today, if you had enough men massed that close together, in a short time, it'd be very difficult to see across that battlefield. Which is one of the reasons, of course, they're all wearing brightly colored uniforms. In that kind of haze, it was important that you know who you were firing at, and you didn't want to have any friendly fire, so the British wore red, the Americans wore blue, or in that case we have grays coming in as well, but distinctive enough to tell the difference usually, so that they didn't fire on their own men. As you can see now, the Americans are massing more and more men through that gate. If the British don't hold them at the gates and force them back out, they are going to be in serious trouble. Because once the Americans can get themselves planted firmly here in Fort George, they will be able to push the British troops right across the entire length of the fortification.
Now you may notice that the Glengarrys here are kneeling, as well as some of the redcoats with them. Light troops were instructed to load kneeling usually, and even taught how to load lying down. The reason not everybody is going to be doing that is, simply put, it takes longer to load a musket kneeling or lying down than it does standing up. You want to win a battle 200 years ago? Stand up and fire as fast as you can across the field at your enemy.
If you... I'm sure you all saw the big smoke ring that comes out occasionally from a cannon. And now you can see the British troops are dropping back once again. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're trying to identify, of course, the commanders on the British side, they are fairly obvious, largely because of the shape of their hats. They are wearing what's known as the chapeau bras, which is that large half-moon style of hat. The general in this case today is the one with the largest amount of feathers. If you see that big cascade of red and white feathers on the top, that is the commanding general of the field.
In both the British and the American Army, officers typically dress much better than their men because they paid for it. As an officer, you were expected to purchase your own uniform, weapons, equipment, pretty much everything. And as a result, the wealth of an officer was very much on parade whenever they went out. They would buy the finest uniforms, they'd have the nicest swords, the nicest hats, and they would even do it in little ways as well. Some of the officers you may notice are wearing small pieces of metal around their neck. These are called gorgets. Gorgets were a symbol of an officer on duty, and they could dress it up. They could have extra things stamped on it, maybe have their name stamped on it somewhere, particular ribbons to dress it up, and it was a simple way to just scream out to everybody, "This is my gorget." Officers were very good at showing off their wealth, but thankfully, we're far more civilized than that. We don't brag about our wealth by what we wear. We do it with what we drive and what we live in.
And just a note now, the American forces are moving up from that front gate. They have increased their grip on the front of the fort there by a good 100 feet. And now it's up to them to try to establish where they've come to and force their British adversaries to drop back even farther. Right now, the British lines are getting particularly thin. I can see that there's already a casualty down on the front. Speaking, of course, to the wild inaccuracy of musket fire. It's one of the reasons why it's fired all at once. Hopes that you'll hit something.
It should be noted that one of the major advantages the Americans had throughout the war is that they tend to rely a lot heavier on rifles in the hands of their light troops. American rifles were extremely deadly, even at long range. The model that they were issued out to their troops was the Model 1803 Harper's Ferry. Its longest confirmed kill during the War of 1812 was at the Siege of Fort Meigs, where an American rifleman at 405 yards successfully picked off a British artillerist. As you're watching the Glengarrys in front of us here, they're doing a leapfrog motion. Light troops were trained to work in pairs, trying to ensure that at all points they had at least one loaded weapon at a time. They would leapfrog over one another, advancing and retiring, ensuring that they could give a somewhat constant rate of fire, or at least be able to respond to any sudden threats out on the battlefield.
There's something you don't see very often. That, of course, is the American colors, actually. The color guard was shot, and he fell with the colors. They're immediately snapped up, of course, by one of the other soldiers. It is a point of honor amongst everything else to defend those colors to the last man. And if you see them drip or drop like that, I should say, you have to move in very quickly and pick them up. See, the British colors are the first things to move back when they are planning to make their own movement. And you can see now, ladies and gentlemen, to your left there, this on the other side of the path here, this is where we've got the companies of American fighters, and they are now moving into a position where they are starting to be able to lay down a fairly almost crossfire at the British troops in the position they are right now. They're getting shot at from the front and shot at from the side. Not a good position to be in whatsoever. And that's why, of course, you see those British troops moving to get into a stronger position where they can use their manpower to lay down those deadly volleys. It speaks highly to the discipline of these British troops as well to be under such devastating... Ladies and gentlemen, it's difficult for you to see, but I can see between the barracks buildings over there that there is a contingent of American troops now that are forcing that far flank. And they are being stoutly defended against by a small group of the British flank. But you can see the majority of the American troops are being massed in the middle. This is, of course, the battalion troops. This is sort of the backbone of the infantry in terms of being able to lay down that withering fire. And the The British have their own center there as well. Their flank is very weak on this side, though, and certainly is in danger of being involved in crossfire if they don't move effectively on the battlefield. You can see it right now. They're having to drop back in these controlled motions. And once again, that speaks incredibly to the discipline of these troops, that they don't break and run. With that much lead coming at them, with that much danger right in front of them in close proximity, and yet they coolly turn around, they march back to where they're supposed to, turn back into position, load their weapons, and are ready to fire. Not many yards are separating those two lines right now, maybe 40 or 50 yards. Very close encounters for this type of weapon, ladies and gentlemen, and can do a tremendous amount of damage when it's that close.
The steadiness of the British troops is also a credit to the Americans. The American Army of 1813 was a vast improvement of the American Army of 1812. Training had improved significantly, command had improved, but still there were many problems with the Army of 1813, particularly in senior command and supply systems. By 1814, though, the American Army would be led by young, aggressive officers who would carry victories for them in 1814, including at Chippewa on July the 5th of 1814, where U.S. regulars did something that not even the Imperial Guard of Napoleon Bonaparte could do, and that was face an equal number of British regulars and beat them. It is from that battle that the U.S. Army gets a bit of a motto. The story goes that as the Americans maneuvered under heavy artillery fire, the British commander exclaimed, "Those are regulars, by God."
Just a footnote to that particular story, it was quoted by Winfield Scott, who was approximately 150 yards away from the British commander when he was said to have said that. So it was either a really exceptional hearing, or I think Winfield Scott was doing a little mind reading, but probably very accurately as well. And ladies and gentlemen, here we've got those two British lines. They're really holding firm. But I think what we're missing is what's going on the other side of that barracks building right now. You can hear the clap of that musketry going on, and they're being very, very hard pressed. And it's very important that these men that are out in the field right now, that far flank we can't see does not get turned, because they could end up surrounded at that point. So it's taking some very cool, calm decisions by the British commanders to move their men constantly in position, keeping them mobile, but also keeping them active and engaging the enemy to keep the enemy from getting too close. But it looks like the way things are going, if you look at where the battle started and where we are right now, you can see for certain, ladies and gentlemen, the British are giving up a tremendous amount of territory. And if it keeps on going this way, it's just a matter of time before the British troops will be forced right out of what remains of the fortifications here at Fort George. Another British soldier down as well, as you just saw, ladies and gentlemen. And now the American flank is moving into position once again, forcing that British center to have to adjust.
The Battle of Fort George was a dark day for the British in this area. They had just barely held on to this region in 1812 with the victory at Queenston Heights. 1813 they hoped would have greater promise for them, but like I mentioned before, the Army of 1813 was vastly improved. Fort George was a shock, a thunderclap, and some believed that the British would withdraw all the way back to Kingston after their drubbing here. But the Army had survived, and they had stalwart officers that did not believe that they were yet defeated. And they would fall back to Burlington Heights, which is around Dundurn Castle today, and they would wait until they would strike back at Stony Creek in modern Hamilton.
Okay, the British are really great practically off the parade square right now. It wasn't a good thing to be a casualty in these battles. If you were shot and you're killed, that's one thing, but if you were wounded laying on a battlefield with the enemy army coming up towards you, it was common for both sides that as they passed by that you would be bayoneted while laying on the ground. And artillery is active once again. Here's, ladies and gentlemen,
It
Yes.
should be noted, ladies and gentlemen, at close range like this, these cannons were probably going to be firing a particularly deadly type of shot called canister. Canister shot was a burlap bag or a tin can filled to the brim with iron musket balls that, when fired, would essentially turn your can into a giant shotgun. Soldiers that had encountered this spoke of it, and one wrote that it sounded like locusts descending upon the pharaohs of old, and that when it struck men, it sounded like fabric being ripped in two. So at close range, these were exceptionally deadly weapons, but at long range, they were still quite deadly. The British Army did testing on guns the size of our kind of last two at the end there, and they found that at a range of 450 yards, those guns had the potential to cut through 17 human beings.
Let me just interrupt here for a second. It looks like the British flank is collapsing on the far side. At least it's rejoining with the center, which means that the British are really under difficult situations. And the Kentucky riflemen now are moved into the artillery area, and it looks like they've captured a couple of the guns, ladies and gentlemen. So that'll put an end to any artillery fire from the British lines at this point. They now seem to be in control of the American troops, and the Americans, of course, are massed to push right up that center and get those British right out of the end of the fort. And yes, the British are now moving en masse. It looks like they are now abandoning the fortification. And when they do, they will be heading right up that, what is now known as the Niagara Parkway, but Queenston Road, of course, right up to Queenston. And from Queenston all the way out to Burlington Heights on the other side of Hamilton before they really make a firm encampment, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, they are still alive to fight another day, as they so fondly say about armies. And there's the Americans laying down another volley to the retreating British troops. Yes, the artillery is pretty well captured. I can see the last British are now starting to move off in the distance. Some of the artillery, oh my goodness, one of the artillerymen who was trying to surrender, shot by the American troops. Obviously, we have a few people's anger up there just a bit today, and a scattering, of course, of casualties all across the battlefield. Another volley from the American troops, and now returned by the British troops. And ladies and gentlemen, if you keep your eye on the flagpole, that will certainly clearly indicate if it's still under control by the British, because that Union Jack would be taken down as soon as American soldiers get there close enough. Legend has it, of course, it was Winfield Scott himself who brought down the Union Jack here at Fort George, riding well ahead of his troops, and apparently falling off his horse just as he got through the gates, but making his way over. And there goes the Union Jack now. It is being brought down.
They're having a bit of trouble with the flag, and as they did just over 200 years ago, Winfield Scott apparently, the only way he could get the British colors down is he had to pull out his sword and cut the rope for it, having it come all the way down, which then led to an additional problem as they came in to put the American flag up and discovered the rope had been cut and had fallen away.
Now, one of the other stories to that was that actually he took an axe and chopped down the mast that had the flag on it, the flag having been nailed in place, and of course there was no flagpole at that point to put the American flag up.
I'm noticing a trend about Winfield Scott stories.
Yes, there's many of them. Yes. I think depending on when Winfield Scott told it, that's the version you got. Well, clearly the Americans are in control of the fort. And ladies and gentlemen, of course, what you've been watching is a reenactment. And keeping in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that there were any number of American, Canadian, British, First Nations people who lost their lives during this particular battle. It was a fairly critical one at the time during the war, and to honor those fallen men who died during this battle, it is tradition that this time that we have fifers and drummers to come forward to play the official lament. When the lament begins, if you are wearing headgear, if you could please take it off in honor of those that fell during this battle. It would be greatly appreciated for that respect. Well, you can keep your hats on, ladies and gentlemen. There's no lament. So, but had there been one, you would have been prepped. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me at this time in honoring our reenactors here today? They did a fantastic job.
Make sure, ladies and gentlemen, if you get a chance going through the camps, to have a chat with some of these folks. They have invested a large amount of time, money, and effort into their impressions, into their uniforms and equipment. And most of them appreciate when someone comes up and says to me, you know, that was great. I really appreciate that you did this, because the vast majority of them who are out here are not doing it for payment. Most of them are doing it for a place to camp and for a breakfast and a lunch from us.
That's right, and of course to have an enjoyable weekend with all sorts of other people of similar passions. But they've just done a terrific job here today, folks. And may I thank you for joining us as well today.